My name is Adonis Vance, and my existence began in the absolute darkness of a state correctional facility for juveniles in Detroit. I was the illegitimate son of the legendary financial titan Apollo Vance, a billionaire investor who died in a mysterious plane crash before I was even born. My mother was a penniless secretary who succumbed to illness shortly after my birth, leaving me to survive the brutal hierarchy of foster homes with nothing but my fists and my father's sharp analytical brain. I spent my youth fighting older boys in concrete yards, learning to read financial balance sheets under the dim light of solitary cells while the world ignored my lineage. My father's legitimate family wallowed in multi-million-dollar mansions, completely unaware that a child carrying the elite Vance genetic code was eating stale bread and bleeding on industrial linoleum floors. My corporate trajectory experienced a radical escalation when I accumulated enough independent day trading capital to buy a single minimum entry share in Vance Global Enterprises. I walked into the annual shareholder meeting at the Central Skyscraper in Manhattan, my cheap suit contrasting sharply with the tailored silk armor of the corporate executives. I waited for the prominent chief executive officer, a ruthless man named Julian Sterling who had systematically usurped my father's legacy, to finish his presentation on quarterly dividends. I stood up in the rear rows, raised my voice, and exposed a massive, unredacted accounting fraud in their international shipping division that caused the entire auditorium to fall into a state of absolute administrative shock. The security guards attempted to eject my frame, but my public display of absolute mathematical dominance had already captured the attention of the financial press. The senior corporate board members viewed my public intervention as an act of absolute domestic terrorism against their stock valuation. Julian Sterling launched a covert corporate investigation into my background, attempting to weaponize my juvenile record to discredit my financial theories before the federal oversight committees. I found myself running through the financial district under a freezing rain, evading private corporate investigators who were tracking my phone signals to seize my research laptops. Instead of retreating into compliance, I moved my operations into a dilapidated boxing gym in Brooklyn, utilizing an old chalkboard to trace the invisible network of shell companies that Julian had utilized to drain my father's estate. The ultimate strategic turning point materialized when I tracked down Marcus "Rocky" Balboa, a retired legendary corporate raider who had been my father's closest business partner before the crash. Marcus was living in absolute isolation, his body ravaged by advanced lymphoma, and his mind detached from the modern high-frequency trading landscape. I walked into his dusty office, threw my birth certificate on his desk, and demanded that he teach me the aggressive boardroom tactics that made the Vance name feared across Wall Street. He initially refused, telling me that the corporate world would consume my soul just like it consumed my father. But when he saw the raw, unyielding fire in my eyes, he agreed to become my chief strategic advisor. The daily social friction within the corporate elite materialized when Julian Sterling offered me a low-level analyst position at a subsidiary branch to neutralize my legal claims to the family name. The human resources directors placed my desk in a windowless room next to the main server closet, assigning me to execute tedious data entry tasks, while the white-collar interns mocked my background. I walked into the executive dining room during a private luncheon, ignored their security protocols, and poured a cup of coffee from Julian's personal artisanal urn while the directors watched in absolute silence. I looked into his eyes, informing him that the name Vance belonged on the front of the building, not on the corporate wastebaskets, a declaration of total administrative war that permanently fractured the peace of the skyscraper. The corporate warfare escalated into the federal courts when Marcus and I launched a massive shareholder derivative lawsuit to invalidate Julian Sterling control over the primary voting shares. We spent 6 weeks analyzing thousands of pages of classified maritime manifests, discovering that Julian had deliberately falsified the safety records of the plane that carried my father to his death. The legal defense team attempted to suppress the evidence utilizing expensive procedural delays, but Marcus utilized his old connections at the Security and Exchange Commission to force a public evidentiary hearing. The tension inside the courtroom was suffocating, as the legacy of a multi-billion-dollar empire rested on the analytical precision of a boy who had learned to calculate numbers in a juvenile cell. The night before the final regulatory vote, Marcus collapsed inside our makeshift Brooklyn war room, his medical monitors reporting a critical respiratory failure due to his progressing cancer. The doctors at the hospital informed me that he needed immediate high-risk thoracic surgery, a medical emergency that threatened to leave me completely alone before the wolves of the corporate board. I sat by his hospital bed, holding his fragile hands while the television screen showed Julian Sterling announcing an emergency stock buyout to liquidate my remaining shares before the morning opening bell. Marcus opened his eyes, gripped my fingers with a surprising physical force, and commanded me to leave the hospital and enter the boardroom to finish the fight we had started. I walked into the top-floor executive suite of Vance Global Enterprises at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, my posture rigid and my mind focused with an absolute clinical clarity. Julian Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table surrounded by his lawyers, his face masked in a smug superior confidence that assumed my absolute financial destruction. I did not utilize a lawyer, choosing instead to project the unredacted satellite tracking data of the falsified shipping vessels directly onto the main corporate screen. I proved to the independent board members that Julian had embezzled $500 million from the corporate pension funds, a devastating revelation that caused his legal team to immediately abandon his defense to avoid federal prosecution. The independent board of directors executed an immediate emergency resolution, stripping Julian Sterling of his chief executive title and voting unanimously to restore the Vance family name to its rightful place of sovereign authority. I stood at the massive panoramic windows looking out over the New York skyline, the golden morning sun illuminating my frame as the journalists outside scrambled to document the historic corporate coup. I was no longer an illegitimate orphan hiding in the shadows of the foster system. I was the undisputed chief executive officer of the empire my father had built from the dirt. The ultimate resolution of my trajectory did not conclude with a celebration inside the luxury restaurants of Manhattan, but with a quiet walk up the stone steps of the Brooklyn Hospital. I entered Marcus' room holding the official corporate registry documents, my hands clean of boardroom ink, while my heart felt a profound permanent peace. He looked at the paperwork, a slow, triumphant smile breaking through his exhausted face as he realized that the legacy of Apollo Vance had finally survived the wolves of Wall Street. We looked out the window together toward the distant skyscrapers, two battered warriors who had utilized nothing but their intellect and their unyielding bloodline to conquer the financial universe from the absolute bottom. The initial stabilization of my executive authority was violently disrupted when a hidden faction of legacy board members triggered a secret liquidity drain through an offshore banking network in Zurich. They intended to artificially collapse the corporate stock value within 48 hours, forcing the federal regulators to step in and freeze my management credentials. I spent 3 consecutive nights inside the central server room with my programming team, tracing the encrypted digital signatures of the fraudulent wire transfers. I discovered that Julian Sterling was still controlling the corporate board from his luxury prison cell through a network of corrupt offshore attorneys. I intercepted the final transaction vector at 4 o'clock in the morning, reversing the multi-million-dollar capital drain and locking the corrupt board members out of their private accounts. A massive European hedge fund managed by a ruthless corporate raider named Victor Drago launched a hostile takeover bid against Vance Global Enterprises. Drago weaponized his vast sovereign wealth reserves to aggressively purchase the floating public shares, publicizing a media campaign that labeled my youth and my background as a high-risk liability for the market. Marcus Rocky Balboa called me from his rehabilitation clinic, advising me to look beyond the domestic stock exchange and seek a defensive alliance with the independent tech conglomerates of Silicon Valley. I flew to California under a false corporate pseudonym, negotiating a massive private placement contract that permanently blocked Drago from acquiring a majority voting status in our company. Julian Sterling loyalists within the Regional Logistics Division organized a massive wildcat strike at our primary automated distribution facility in Chicago, paralyzing our supply chain. They blocked the transport trucks and sabotaged the internal mainframe routers, causing a daily revenue loss of $12 million that threatened to breach our debt covenants with the central banks. Instead of deploying corporate security forces, I traveled to Chicago alone, entering the chaotic warehouse floor to confront the union leaders face to face without a single bodyguard. I presented them with an unredacted breakdown of the embezzlement schemes Julian had executed against their pension funds, proving that I was the only leader willing to legally guarantee their retirement security. The Federal Trade Commission launched a surprise antitrust investigation into our newly acquired artificial intelligence subdivision, acting on a manufactured anonymous tip from our competitors. A team of 20 federal agents entered our Manhattan headquarters with a corporate search warrant, seizing our executive servers and forcing our legal team into a defensive posture. I realized the investigation was a coordinated political trap designed by Julian Sterling political allies in Washington to freeze our upcoming global expansion. I spent 12 hours inside the congressional hearing room, utilizing a single digital projector to prove that our technology was actually expanding market competition and reducing consumer costs across the country. My private corporate secretary, a woman I had personally promoted from the basement typing pool, was caught transferring classified board minutes to Victor Drago hedge fund. She had succumbed to a massive financial bribe to pay for her family medical expenses, a tragic vulnerability that our enemies had ruthlessly exploited. I cornered her frame inside the executive library after hours, holding the digital forensic evidence that confirmed her corporate espionage. Instead of handing her over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I forced her to feed Drago false strategic data regarding our upcoming stock split, turning her betrayal into a double-agent operation that completely decimated our enemy financial position during the next trading cycle. Victor Drago attempted a final desperate short squeeze operation against our stock during the annual New York Financial Summit, utilizing automated high-frequency trading algorithms to drive our value down to zero. The main trading floor was plunged into absolute chaos as panic selling spread among our institutional investors, threatening to liquidate our entire corporate foundation before noon. I ordered our chief technology officer to execute a complete digital blackout of our primary trading servers, halting all electronic transactions for 2 critical hours. This high-risk manual intervention broke the momentum of the automated algorithms, allowing Marcus to coordinate a massive counter-buyback with our ally funds that restored our market dominance. The structural stability of our strategic alliance suffered a severe blow when Marcus experienced a major cardiac relapse during our preparation for the federal court hearings. The medical team placed him in a medically induced coma, leaving me completely isolated without my chief advisor just as Victor Drago launched a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit to invalidate our Silicon Valley contracts. The financial press gathered outside the hospital gates, openly predicting that my corporate defense would collapse without the guiding hand of the old titan. I stood in the intensive care unit looking at his pale face, promising him that the empire we had reclaimed from the dirt would not fall to the wolves of Wall Street. Our competitors launched a massive patent infringement lawsuit against our core logistics software, claiming that my father had stolen the original source code from a defunct military contractor in 1994. The legal challenge threatened to permanently freeze our automated shipping networks, a structural disaster that would have resulted in immediate corporate bankruptcy. I traveled to my father's old private estate in Rhode Island spending 48 hours digging through crates of dust-covered physical blueprints in the basement archives. I located the original hand-written journal containing his independent mathematical derivations, proving our absolute historical ownership of the technology and forcing the court to dismiss the fraudulent lawsuit with prejudice. I initiated a comprehensive shadow audit of every legacy executive position within Vance Global Enterprises, utilizing an independent forensic accounting firm from London to root out any remaining corruption. The audit revealed a massive network of kickbacks and falsified expense reports that had drained $50 million from our regional offices over the past decade. I summoned the 10 corrupt vice presidents into the main boardroom simultaneously, placing their termination papers and their criminal profiles on the table before them without a single word of greeting. This clean sweep of the corporate hierarchy solidified my absolute sovereignty over the company, replacing the corrupt elite with young, hungry analysts from the bottom pools. I flew to Monaco to confront Victor Drago directly on his luxury yacht during the International Financial Gala, breaking through his security perimeter to deliver a formal corporate warning face-to-face. I threw a leather folder containing the forensic evidence of his illegal short-selling operations onto his card table, informing him that the next trade he executed against my family company would result in an immediate international arrest warrant. His face turned to a mask of absolute freezing rage as he realized that a boy from the Detroit juvenile system had successfully outmaneuvered his global security apparatus. This aggressive display of absolute dominance forced him to officially withdraw his hostile takeover bid, permanently securing our financial independence. Julian Sterling legal defense team attempted a final desperate maneuver to seize my father's private trust funds, utilizing a complex labyrinth of forgotten corporate bylaws from 1982. They claimed that, because I was born out of wedlock, my genetic lineage did not possess the legal right to inherit the primary voting stock of the parent company. I spent a week inside the state's Supreme Court archives, analyzing historical inheritance laws alongside my legal team to find a structural counter-strategy. I discovered a private codicil signed by my father 3 days before his death, which explicitly designated all his intellectual and financial properties to his biological heirs regardless of their legal status, permanently crushing Julian's final play. A massive cyber attack targeting our central logistics database occurred on a Saturday afternoon, freezing the operations of 3,000 automated shipping vessels across the globe. The hackers demanded a ransom of $100 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, threatening to wipe our entire customer directory if the payment was not executed within 6 hours. I refused to negotiate with the digital terrorists, taking the lead seat at the main programming terminal to manually isolate the primary network nodes. I utilized my father's old reverse engineering formulas to trace the digital signature of the attack to a rogue server network in Eastern Europe, neutralizing the virus and restoring global operations, with 20 minutes left on the countdown. Marcus Rocky Balboa miraculously awoke from his medically induced coma, his physical strength returning, just in time for the annual Global Economic Forum in Switzerland. He walked into the main conference hall leaning on a cane, but wearing an immaculate tailored suit, his presence causing a massive stir among the international banking elite. He took his place beside my frame at the primary presentation table, declaring to the global press that the alliance between the old guard and the new generation was completely unshakable. His return restored absolute confidence in our corporate governance, driving our stock valuation to a historic, all-time high within 30 minutes of his speech. The final conflict for the absolute control of Vance Global Enterprises materialized during the official proxy voting session at our Manhattan headquarters. The legacy shareholders who still resented my background coordinated a final attempt to vote me out of the chief executive position, utilizing their collective blocks of stock to force a structural showdown. I stood before the assembly of billionaires, refusing to utilize a prepared speech or a corporate slide presentation to defend my management records. I reminded them that under my short tenure, our corporate revenues had expanded by 300%, while their private dividends had reached unprecedented heights, forcing them to vote overwhelmingly to retain my leadership. I returned to Detroit to purchase the abandoned industrial yard where the juvenile facility of my youth had once stood, transforming the concrete space into a massive high-tech corporate incubator for underprivileged youth. I invested $50 million of my private fortune to build state-of-the-art software laboratories and financial training centers, creating a direct employment pipeline into our global offices. I stood before the first class of young students, informing them that their current socioeconomic background was not a legal limitation on their eventual destiny. This reclamation of my past transformed our corporate public image, establishing Vance Global Enterprises as a model of progressive capitalism. Julian Sterling filed for personal bankruptcy from his federal prison cell, his remaining assets and private shell companies being systematically liquidated by the state to pay for his massive corporate fines. I authorized our corporate treasury department to purchase his family estate in Connecticut at a public auction for a fraction of its original value. I transformed the luxurious mansion into a permanent recovery retreat for retired corporate workers who had suffered from industrial illnesses, a final poetic justice that completely erased his name from the historical landscape of the financial world. We announced a historic corporate merger with the primary satellite communications network of Japan, creating a global logistical monopoly that controlled the data streams of 60 different international ports. The merger established Vance Global Enterprises as the single most powerful infrastructure conglomerate on the planet, completely insulated from the localized market fluctuations of Wall Street. I signed the official treaty documents inside the Tokyo Executive Chamber, the golden afternoon sun illuminating my frame as the international ministers offered a standing ovation to our global strategic vision. Despite my multi-billion-dollar status and my executive offices in Manhattan, I maintained the old dusty chalkboard from our Brooklyn war room inside my private suite. Every Sunday evening I would sit alone in the quiet office, using a piece of white chalk to manually derive the fundamental economic models for our upcoming corporate quarters. This simple tradition kept my mind anchored to the raw analytical focus that had saved my life in the juvenile cells, ensuring that my executive decisions remained completely detached from the arrogant illusions of wealth. The Internal Revenue Service completed a comprehensive 5-year audit of my private financial records, confirming that my corporate ascension had been executed with an absolute adherence to the federal tax laws. The lead auditor presented the final clearance certificates to my desk, admitting that he had never reviewed a financial profile of my magnitude that carried 0 discrepancies. This absolute legal validation silenced our remaining political detractors in Washington, establishing my status as an unassailable titan of American industry who was completely beyond the reach of corporate scandal. Marcus Rocky Balboa officially announced his permanent retirement from the corporate advisory board, choosing to spend his remaining years in a beautiful, quiet estate overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. We sat together on his private veranda during his final evening in New York, drinking a toast to the memory of my father and the long, bloody warfare we had survived together. He handed me his old leather notebook containing 40 years of Wall Street secrets, informing me that the pupil had officially surpassed the master and that the future of the empire was completely secure in my hands. I was invited to serve as the keynote speaker at the annual Wall Street Investment Gala, an elite event that had traditionally excluded my father during the early years of his financial career. I walked into the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, my presence drawing the immediate attention of every prominent hedge fund manager and central banker in the country. I used my speech to openly criticize the predatory lending practices of the traditional banking elite, challenging them to invest their capital into the real industrial growth of the nation rather than speculative derivative markets. The Harvard Business School appointed my frame as a permanent visiting professor of strategic corporate governance, requesting that I deliver a lecture series on the integration of reverse engineering mathematics into modern market analysis. I stood before the class of elite graduate students, utilizing the chalkboard to demonstrate how my juvenile cell calculations had successfully defeated the automated trading algorithms of Victor Drago. My presence on the academic platform solidified my intellectual authority, proving that our unconventional boardroom strategies had officially become the new standard foundation for global corporate education. We established the Apollo Vance Memorial Library inside our Manhattan headquarters, creating a permanent historical archive that housed all the original blueprints, financial ledgers, and journals compiled by my father during his life. The archive was open to the public, providing young independent researchers with free access to the foundational economic data that had built our global logistics network. I stood by the bronze bust of my father during the opening ceremony, realizing that my long journey through the corporate wilderness had successfully restored his historical legacy to its rightful place of honor. I authorized a massive $500 million investment into the development of automated hydrogen-powered cargo vessels, shifting our entire logistics fleet away from traditional fossil fuels. This strategic transition positioned Vance Global Enterprises as the global leader in sustainable maritime transport, securing long-term exclusive contracts with the environmental regulatory agencies of the European Union. The stock market responded with an immediate surge, validating my theory that environmental sustainability was completely compatible with peak corporate profitability. A sudden political crisis in the Middle East threatened to close the Suez Canal, a geopolitical emergency that would have stranded 40% of our active cargo vessels in the Red Sea. I returned to the Manhattan control room at midnight, coordinating a real-time rerouting strategy with our satellite network to guide our ships through the alternative African maritime corridors. My swift, decisive intervention prevented a massive global supply chain disruption, ensuring that our corporate customers received their shipments without a single hour of administrative delay. The passage of time brought a serene stability to our corporate operations, our global logistics network running with the flawless precision of a well-calibrated machine. I spent my days mentoring the young directors I had selected from our Detroit incubator, watching them manage the complex regional offices with the same raw analytical focus that had defined my own youth. I realized that my true legacy was not the multi-billion-dollar valuation of our stock, but the permanent destruction of the old nepotistic hierarchy that had traditionally controlled Wall Street. My legal team successfully finalized the global copyright protections for our core automated navigation software, securing a permanent royalty stream that guaranteed our financial sovereignty for the next 50 years. The software was officially registered under the name, the Vance algorithm, a lasting tribute to my father's genius that generated billions of dollars in passive revenue from our international competitors who were forced to license the technology to survive. I stood on the private terrace of my penthouse suite looking out at the golden sunset illuminating the Manhattan skyscrapers, my heart feeling a profound permanent peace that had eluded me since childhood. The screams of the juvenile detention yards and the cold isolation of the foster homes had been completely silenced, replaced by the magnificent grand symphony of a legitimate life that had conquered the financial universe through the sheer power of intellect. Our chief financial officer delivered the comprehensive year-end report to my desk, confirming that Vance Global Enterprises had officially achieved a zero-debt status, while maintaining a cash reserve of $3 billion. This unprecedented financial security established our company as the most stable infrastructure conglomerate in the world, completely immune to the hostile designs of any future corporate raiders or global economic recessions. The ultimate convergence of my family destiny did not conclude with an arrogant display of corporate vanity or a televised celebration inside the high-rise offices of Manhattan. It resolved inside the quiet, dim basement of the old Detroit foster home, where I had spent my childhood calculating numbers on the cold concrete floor. I sat on a broken wooden crate, my immaculate tailored suit pressing against the rough brick wall, while I watched the morning sun slowly cut through the rusted iron window bars. There were no flashing cameras, no board members bowing to my authority, and no luxury glass walls to separate my frame from the memory of the dirt. I pulled an old creased photograph of my mother from my leather wallet, placing it gently on the small concrete ledge before me alongside the multi-billion-dollar ownership certificates of Vance Global Enterprises. I realized that the absolute victory of my life was not the accumulation of the empire or the destruction of Julian Sterling, but the reality that the nameless orphan they had tried to bury had returned to claim his bloodline in total, unshakable silence. The ambient sounds of the distant city traffic faded into a profound calm. The dust motes froze in the golden sunbeams, and my heart finally achieved an absolute permanent peace as the screen slowly faded to a deep, permanent midnight black.